Hello, everybody, and welcome to Narrative Live on a Tuesday evening at 7 p.m. on the East Coast to 4 p.m. on the West Coast and a little bit after midnight in Jersey. Thanks for staying up with us, Stuart Syvret, the state senator from Syvret, previous state senator. You've been very kind to accommodate us at this late hour, and I'm so glad you're here for another conversation with our audience about what happened in Jersey and how it relates to the monarchy, the child abuse case that happened there, the fact that it's really used as a crime haven, money laundering center that impacts the entire world. So I'm really thrilled that you're here tonight. How are you doing?
I'm okay. Much the same as usual. It's a difficult kind of a war that we're involved in, but I'm constantly buoyed and encouraged by the amount of international support I get from other, campaigners, people like yourself and others. And yeah, we live in very interesting times, unique times in so many ways. This is, of course, the 6-month anniversary after the attempted insurrection, which was a moment of I'm still not sure most people actually quite yet got their heads around, certainly on this side of the pond,
Or
just
this side, I would
how
say.
serious it was, just how serious it was. Literally, I watched that unfolding live, and I knew then that we were watching basically civilization hanging by a thread. Had the insurrectionists succeeded, frankly, America would be in the pits of civil war right now, and the enemies of the West would be doing what we expect them to do, and it could very well have been basically the end of the Western Enlightenment project. That's how serious it was.
I think you're right. Not only that, I think we are still in an information civil war.
Yeah.
I don't think we're out of it. And I think that was one act of that information civil war, but surely there's lots more to come. The reality of what we're dealing with here is that the old world, as it were, the autocrats and some would say even the monarchists, are at odds with democracy. And we are beginning to see that conflict bubble up in a way which is becoming very real in terms of lives and in terms of events, as you described on the 6-month anniversary of January the 6th, that attempted coup that happened. I call it an attempted coup. People might call it other things, but we've done an extraordinary amount of investigating here on Narativ with an incredible amount of people who are, working journalists, but also citizen journalists, and just to give people a sense of how far, we've gone in this investigation. It has so many tentacles. We've did maybe 16 hours so far of full investigations, and it's gone through things like first identifying when the conspiracy was announced, or at least begun to be discussed publicly, which was around September 10th, so early last year. Then we looked at what Miller, the defense secretary, and Michael Flynn, what they were doing, and Charles Flynn, what he was doing inside the military, delaying the National Guard for who knows what reason. It's still unclear why the National Guard was delayed for so long. We've looked at who the key plotters are. We've identified Stone, Alex Jones, and others. And we've also traced the whole thing back to the Council for National Policy, which is a very important organization in the United States, which is working towards creating a theocracy in the United States. Plus, we followed the money, and we've gone all the way to all the domestic suppliers of the money, like the Publix woman down in Florida, but also the Moonies, of all people, who are supporting this organization called AON, which is a news network here, runs opposed CNN, and is running basically propaganda for the Moonies. And there's also indications of Chinese and Asian money flowing into the Proud Boys. It's really unusual. On top of that, you've got this QAnon thing that we've exposed along with so many great people on the show. And of course, the case against Roger Stone we've discussed. Last week, we even told people about this thing called the First Amendment Praetorians, which is another militia
Praetorians,
group. It's another militia group that no one had really heard of, and that what they are doing is basically the same kind of thing. They're building up an attempt to have a revolution in America. Now, the last time we had a revolution in this country was to get rid of the King of Britain. He was not welcome here, and we thought we'd gotten rid of him, but it still seems like the Queen and the monarchy have quite a lot of influence here on this side of the pond. And that comes through transnational crime, which you have been valiantly fighting against for a very long time. Now, Jersey, as we all know, is an offshore tax haven. It's not meant to be an offshore criminal haven, but because it's a tax haven, it attracts all these criminals. Tell us how that really works.
Jersey is a crown dependency, which means that it's not part of the United Kingdom, but it is British, and it answers effectively to the crown, to the monarch herself. So basically, the authorities on Jersey ultimately are only answerable and responsible to the monarch. Now, Jersey has always used its privileged connection to the English monarchy, to the British monarchy, for many centuries, because ever since the days of William the Conqueror and then King John, the the elites, the feudal elites of the Channel Islands, have pledged their allegiance to the English monarch in return for the English monarch granting the elite on the Channel Islands all kinds of privileges and powers, so that they would retain a kind of quasi-independence and things of that nature. So that's the historical picture. So what the Jersey elites have essentially done for centuries, as well as things like slave trading and that kind of stuff, essentially what they did throughout most of the centuries was piracy. They were privateers. They were essentially licensed by the monarch to go off and carry out war against the ships of other nations, the enemies of England. And
legitimate piracy, like real piracy, like just going on in the seas and stealing.
Absolutely, real piracy.
I had no idea.
And the way the deal works, the local pirates, the privateers, the corsairs, they get to keep a lot of the booty, and the monarch gets a cut of the action.
That's gone all the way back for forever, for as long as people.
Centuries.
Wow. Okay.
And
what was the cut? Do we know how much does a king or queen get cut in on a private piracy loot? Do you have any idea?
I don't know. That probably varied on a case-by-case basis, depending who the leaders of the island are called the bailiff, who's a person appointed by the monarch, who's the head of the legislature and the judiciary. So effectively, that person has been the power, as it were, of the monarch on the island, and it's they that have traditionally decided what's going to happen or not happen and who gets a cut of what over the centuries. And regrettably, as we've discovered because of the Jersey situation, it's very much still like that in the late 20th century and on into the 21st century. And consequently, and the wealth, the economic advantage of Jersey, by accident really, because of the nature of the globalizing economy after World War II, and then the intervention, the arrival of electronic communications. Jersey just slipped very conveniently and easily from being an actual pirate base for centuries into being a financial pirate base. And that's essentially what Jersey does.
Right. Its number one industry is financial institutions, which basically
by miles,
it basically involves registering offshore companies a lot of the time for gangsters, mobsters, drug dealers, you name it, who want to hide their money somewhere, don't want to pay taxes. That's where they go and do it. And the Queen, as you suggest, does she get a cut of all of that? Is that still the case where because they're doing the banking there, she gets a cut of it?
There's no reason to assume otherwise. That's always how it worked in the old days, and there's never been any change. The Queen actually does her private personal banking here. A local private bank, and it all works out very conveniently. And of course, one of the components of this system, as it were, which perhaps isn't focused on enough, is actually the ancient City of London Corporation itself, which of course was famously empowered and established by Magna Carta. That body, of course, still exists with huge power today. It's like effectively a state within a state in Britain. The City of London has all kinds of powers and privileges that ordinary people in the rest of Britain don't get. And they actually have, quite remarkably, because of Magna Carta, a lot of direct actual power over the monarch. The guilds of the City of London can demand an audience with the monarch whenever they so choose.
Oh, really?
And there is this ancient post in the Houses of Parliament who has an automatic right to sit in the Houses of Parliament and to always discuss and be consulted by the Speaker of the House of Commons and of the House of Lords. And this office is called the Office of the Remembrancer. And that is a post of the City of London Corporation. So you can see how the City of London Corporation, all the ancient banks, law firms in particular, and accountancy practices that are concentrated in the square mile in the City of London, have this immense power and lobby over the very corridors of power, over the palace as well as Westminster.
Absolutely. So the financial sector has been important to the UK and to Great Britain, and particularly law has been important to the country as a way of getting revenue. It's really what people have looked at as a place of stable law and governance. That's why people like to bank there, presumably, is because you get to keep your money. Now, is the Queen aware of everyone who's investing in the island? Probably she knows some of it. She doesn't necessarily need to know all of it, but she might be getting a cut of it. That seems very likely. Where it connects so interestingly for me is you are most notably known for raising the alarm around the child abuse scandal that happened in Jersey, involving Jimmy Savile particularly, but also involving a whole lot of other people on that island. And you paid a pretty hefty price for that personally, and we'll discuss a little bit of that later on. But tonight, for the first time, we're going to take a look at the Queen's response to you, which has never really happened before, at least response to the scandal and the complaints around that.
Response to the scandal, yeah.
Yeah. And it's not a very long document, but it is a document that is going to show you what certainly the people around the Queen, the private secretary, thought of the scandal at the time and how they sought to manage it at the time. And these are a series of letters, but only one from the actual palace that is, I believe, in there. So we're going to go through that in the second half of the show. But is there anything you want to say about those letters before we get there and how important they are to the story?
But believe it or not, there are a few good, honest lawyers around. And we have one in Jersey, at least, Advocate Philip Sinnell, who was aware of these atrocities. He took it after the issue got raised. He recognized fairly early that these were true and legitimate concerns. So he followed the saga and did what he could to try and help the police under their good leadership then, and to try and assist people like me and others. But of course, ultimately, he was met by absolute stonewalled blockages from the United Kingdom, from the palace, and from the United Kingdom Justice Department. So the correspondence that you have there is correspondence that took place between Advocate Sinnell and the palace.
Right.
And it's clear from that correspondence, and there are a number of emails and letters in there. There's one from signed by Sir Paul Geit, who was then the Queen's personal private secretary. That's Buckingham Palace. That was.
I'm looking at that right now. Just put it up for everyone to see. They go, oh, sorry, you're holding it up in your hand there as well. But let me cut back to us so you can show them. There you go. That's that very document we're talking about there. And there it says Buckingham Palace at the top. It's got a date on it. What is the date there?
The date of that letter is the 22nd of June, 2015. And
so we're not talking about a long time ago. The scandal was dated back to the early 2000s, mid-2000s. But this is correspondence that happened in 2015. As recent as that.
Yeah, I mean, there's another letter here too. This one was addressed to. This one came from Balmoral Castle, where the Queen was at that time.
Okay, I don't think I've seen that.
You can see that these two letters amount essentially to a couple of paragraphs, which were contemptuously dismissive of what were the most profound and serious concerns. Advocate Sinnell was explaining truthfully and frankly to the monarch, who has ultimately legal and constitutional responsibility for the welfare of her subjects on the Channel Islands. He was explaining to her the utter corruption in the Jersey judiciary, which we'll perhaps come on to a little bit later, but explaining how so many vulnerable children had been abused, how rapes had been concealed, how murders had been concealed, how the powers of the Crown effectively were being used to oppress and suppress not only me, but also the former police chief, Graham Power, the former deputy police chief. And these are the most serious of concerns that were being raised about child abuse and the death of, Advocate Sinnell describes the death of Daniela Jarman, who, if you cast your mind back to the BBC Storyville documentary, Daniela actually is one of the people who appeared in that documentary. That footage was filmed with her in 2008 by BBC Panorama, who I eventually succeeded in getting interested to come and try and expose some of the Jersey cover-ups. Daniela was, I'm as certain as I can be, she died in, I think, December 2015, and bluntly, she was murdered. She was one of at least two people to have been murdered who were closely associated with the child abuse investigation.
And what makes you say that? What makes you say that it was a murder?
Because she didn't have any serious health concerns or other issues at the time. She was a profoundly problematic witness to the Jersey establishment, who were running a fake public inquiry at the stage, which she had given evidence to. But they knew perfectly well, because she was publicly a public figure for survivors, and she had been interviewed in the Panorama program, when the public inquiry report came out, and it ended up being pretty much fake and full of mendacity and omissions, and it had constructively, illegally excluded me from giving evidence to it through a variety of methods. Daniela wouldn't have taken that quietly. She would have been the media condemning the quality of the report, and in particular, she would have been condemning the transnational mobster law firm, basically Applebee's, who were fundamentally involved from the very, very get-go in oppressing and obstructing me from late 2007 on, and then were responsible for all these trumped up data protection charges against me, which ended up having me becoming Jersey's first political prisoner since the Nazis got thrown out. So Daniela was a huge problem to them.
And also your colleague in arms in this thing. It sounds like she was the person who was fighting closely with you in getting this attention out there. That must send a chill down your spine in terms of your own concerns.
The abuse episode, she was one of a number of children, orphans, that were in the infamous Blanche Pierre group home. And they were absolutely, for a period of years, basically tortured and abused and molested in all kinds of psychopathic ways by a couple, Jane and Alan Maguire, who were running the place, clearly unmitigated psychopaths. And this was throughout the late 1980s. And the Jersey authorities knew about this and repeatedly turned a blind eye to the abuse. So you can see from that reason, Daniela was a dramatically important witness. And it so happens that the very last night of her life, she was out socializing at a place in Jersey, the Radisson Blu Waterfront Hotel. And for that reason, I can't go into further details for legal reasons, because they'll just put me in prison again. But it's fair to say we've all got a pretty good idea who they got to kill her.
Oh. It's such an unbelievable situation you find yourself in Jersey, because you think of the United Kingdom of Great Britain as a place where there's a lot of political freedom and freedom of speech and freedom of activity and association like this. But those letters that we're going to go through later on and what you're just describing here now almost describes a place that is as draconian as Belarus is today. Belarus is today. It sounds like an autocratic, dictatorial environment that you're living in.
Sure. The way I try to describe how Jersey works to people is that to look at Jersey from the outside, it looks very kind of middle class and respectable and well governed. It looks neat and tidy, and it's got a low street crime rate. And it appears to have a legislature and a judicial system and a police force and a prosecution system, all the normal components of a functioning state. But in truth, all of that's fake. All of that's just window dressing, just stage props. It's all a Potemkin village. Jersey is a pure feudatory. It's a pure feudal monarchy still. And just European states were in centuries gone by. And because of the inherent vulnerabilities that a monarchical system has to corruption and all kinds of pushing and pulling influences by various factions of courtiers, in the modern era, with so many billions of dollars flowing around the world so quickly, it was very easy for the monarchy's powers to become completely abused, corrupted, captured. And essentially, Jersey has probably an ancient kind of feudal mafia system. And Jersey is run and has been run for centuries and centuries by essentially what are the local crime families. Local, elite.
The pirates, basically. The pirates that were still...
Pirates, yeah. But the great, I say this often, but it bears repeating, the great achievement, if we can call it that, of the Jersey mafia syndicates is that their control has been so total and complete that they've achieved that thing that most mafia syndicates around the world can only dream of, which is complete invisibility.
Right.
People never looked at Jersey and thought, oh, that's a place like Sicily or Corsica or Malta, where the mafia activity is really obvious. None of that was visible in Jersey, but it hasn't needed to be, because the local crime families are the police force, the judiciary, and the courts.
It hasn't been invisible either, because people have obviously been going through these terrible atrocities. They just have never been exposed. And so your story of revealing some of the stuff that's been going on there, along with just many other documentation and documentaries and evidence from the Panama documents and elsewhere, there's a clear line of evidence now that shows us that Jersey is not the kind of place that you go to if you want to do kosher booking, or kosher bookkeeping, I should say. It's the kind of place you want to swindle stuff, and that's why it exists, and it's probably been like that forever for a good reason. It's because it makes someone a lot of money. Now, the Queen is, and I think it's important just to stress this. You said to me this before, that you don't think that the Queen is necessarily like wholly responsible for this criminal activity over there. It's more that she's been used, or the system of the crown has been used by the local officials there. Is that correct?
What I would say to that is that, and this is in many ways the problem, we just don't actually know, and we have no way of knowing how much the monarch herself does or does not know about the direct corruptions and the catalogue of staggering criminality that's gone on in Jersey. Now, it may well be that she is innocent of a lot of that kind of knowledge and is surrounded by these frankly dishonest and mendacious advisors like Christopher Geit, and who have just misled her and advised her extremely poorly over the decades. That could indeed be one scenario. But on the other hand, bluntly, the Queen is, of course, the head of the Privy Council, which again is a rather, frankly, mysterious and ill-defined and bizarre component of the British Constitution. She is the head of the Privy Council, which meets routinely with the Prime Minister and other senior people. And there's no doubt that people like, for example, the then Justice Secretary in 2007 and 8, who I wrote to very extensively about the absolute breakdown in the rule of law on Jersey and the undisguised judicial corruption. He certainly, as a Privy Councillor and as the Justice Secretary with responsibility, for the Crown dependencies, will undoubtedly have had discussions with the monarch and her closest advisors about the Jersey situation. So why then did the Queen's directly appointed and empowered representatives on Jersey, like the bailiffs and attorney generals, end up covering up child abuse, letting people like Jimmy Savile off the hook, letting local rapists and psychopaths and murderers off the hook, and suppressing illegally, letting the mob hijack the Jersey police force via the illegal suspension of the good police chief, Graham Power, and then jailed for trying to represent my constituents and speaking out on their behalf. And one of the crazy things about that time is that it's worth remembering that the scandal about Jimmy Savile, the infamous British child abuser, didn't erupt until shortly after his death, I think in late 2011. Now, Savile, as we saw from the Storyville documentary, had been abusing kids and was guilty of molesting people that were my constituents on Jersey. So when I was speaking out on their behalf in 2007 and 8, and then the police got hijacked and the police were doing things like carrying out a massed dawn raid against me when I was the senior senator and the only significant opposition politician Jersey's ever had, without a search warrant, like a 10-strong police squad, without a search warrant, just arresting me and carting me off to the jail and stealing all of my data on all of my computers, my records, basically stealing the private data, hundreds and hundreds of my constituents who have written to me and spoken with me about all kinds of very private matters. And this was all basically seized by the police. Now, that was a deliberate and calculated act designed to terrify and frighten off other survivors and other people and witnesses and whistleblowers from having any further contact with me. This was a big kind of hit that was designed absolutely to instill a climate of fear
and discredit you,
people on Jersey, and to discredit me. And when you look at the actual technical legal definitions of terrorism under the United Kingdom terrorism law and under the United States and under the accepted definitions by the United Nations and a lot of other countries, the whole enterprise of illegally suspending the police chief and then turning this captured, corrupted, mafiaized police force against free and fair and proper functioning democracy and against the proper representation of ordinary members of the public and causing fear amongst the public, stopping them being able to enjoy their proper political representation, that's an act of terrorism. So effectively, what was done by the Jersey mob in the suspension of the police chief and then going against me was an act of terrorism.
I'm going to stop you there.
That was ultimately authorized by Buckingham Palace.
Are you sure it was authorized by the Buckingham Palace? I mean, is there a record of that, or is it just?
Yeah. We can be absolutely certain of that, because as crazed and as a number of them, like the Balash brothers, for example, are plainly diagnosable psychopaths. But as mad and as corrupt and as hubristic as the local mob are, and used to absolute immunity and total power, not even they, I think, would have gone as far as illegally suspending the police chief and then politically oppressing and suppressing the only significant opposition
Yeah, that would have been an operation.
Yeah, and unless they had been given the green light, they absolutely would have been given the green light for that. And of course, at that time when this was happening, Jimmy Savile was still alive. He was a very close friend of Prince Andrew, Charles. Prince Charles also is a very close friend of a former Church of England bishop, Peter.
We are going to go there after the break. So let's stop here because we've got to take the break. And then we'll be right back and we'll take a look at Charles. We'll like to look at the future monarch of Great Britain. And he's about to become regent by all accounts. So he will be in charge. And he has lots of connections to various scandals involving child abuse. And that comes up after this break. We'll be right back. Now that summer's almost here and COVID is almost gone, this may be a good time to get some things off your to-do list, like maybe getting life insurance. My mom is really good with finances, and she's always telling me, what about life insurance? It's so important. And I can tell you that Policy Genius is a great place to get life insurance because you can compare quotes from over a dozen top insurers all in one place. Why compare when you can save as much as 50% or more of life insurance by comparing those quotes? And you could save $1,300 or more per year on life insurance by using Policy Genius to compare those policies for you. The licensed experts at Policy Genius work for you, not the insurance companies, so you can trust them to help you navigate every step of the shopping and buying process. That kind of service has earned Policy Genius a 5-star rating across thousands of reviews on Trustpilot and Google. This is how it works. Getting started is really easy. First, you head to policygenius.com, and in minutes, you can work out how much life insurance coverage you need and compare personalized quotes to find your best price. When you're ready to apply, the Policy Genius team will handle all the paperwork and scheduling for you. Policy Genius never sells your information to other companies, and that means you don't have to worry about your privacy, and they don't add extra fees. Policy Genius. Head to policygenius.com to get started right now. Policy Genius. When it comes to insurance, it's nice to get it right. And welcome back. You're watching Narativ Live. Stuart Syvret is our guest from Jersey, the island of Jersey, off the coast of France, as it were, actually. You had a bit of an incident there earlier on this year, didn't it? Wasn't the British monarch sending her navy over for a couple of days, and there was an incident involving the French? What was going on with that?
Yeah, and that's a consequence of, I guess, what we could call our version of the Trump nightmare over here on this side of the pond, which, of course, is Brexit, the absolutely deranged and completely destructive and damaging withdrawal of the UK from Brexit. Because of that, all kinds of consequences have happened and are going to happen even more dramatically and damagingly to Britain. But one of those is that the existing EU fishing agreements got, scrapped, as it were. So the French, the Jersey authorities decided that they were going to revel in this new power and decided to rip up the fishing agreement and exclude lots of French fishermen who had traditionally fished in our waters out of it. So the French, of course, weren't having that. So they sent a flotilla of their fishing boats over to blockade St Heliers harbour as a protest. And in response to this, the ridiculous stunt by the idiot Boris Johnson, these awful government, they sent a couple of Royal Navy destroyers over. So it was comic. It was comedy gold.
It's comedy gold, but it does add up to a lot of what we've been saying on Narativ and elsewhere with all our colleagues on Twitter. This is a part of a giant transnational mob that's taking over the world, or at least trying to. So when you look at things like Brexit and you look at things like Trump and you look at these are significant elements of this transnational crime organizations that are invading our institutions and invading our countries and overtaking them to some extent. And Brexit is a perfect example of that. And so this is not anything anyone really wanted except for Putin. I can't think of anyone else who really would have thought if this was a good idea. And it's important to remember that there in Jersey is a lot of Russian mob money because, in fact, that's where they like to do a lot of their banking because there's a lot of very wealthy oligarchs living in London, some of the richest. And I think about Abramovich in particular. He's probably the richest in London. And so you've got these elements that are, you can call them oligarchs, but they're also transnational criminals. And so this is not just let's have a skirmish about boats and whatever. It's a fundamental shift in power that's taking over our institutions, taking over our justice systems, and replacing it with this bizarre feudal system, as you describe it. It's a system that we don't recognize from the modern era. It's a system where if you're Prince Charles, you get a set of rules. If you're Donald Trump, you get a set of rules. If you're anybody else, no, you don't get those rules. You have to have much stricter rules to follow.
I've said to people in America and Americans and others, I've said this very often, America and Britain, the broad populations of both of our nations regard each other as allies. We imagine Britain and America where, when the chips are down, we'll stand shoulder to shoulder, as we did in 2 world wars. So there's this kind of naive view that Britain, therefore, is a natural and strong ally of the USA. Most of the British people may well be, and, a lot of the ordinary aspects of the state. But I've no doubt whatsoever that when you get down to the real British power elite, since the American Revolution, I don't think they've ever, frankly, accepted the constitutional political settlement of the United States and have hated and feared the idea of a lawful constitutionalism system, greatly preferring the maintenance of monarchy. So today, I've got no doubt at all that a substantial part of the British traditional elites, the landowning elites, they would much rather bluntly ally to Putin, and they would rather see Putin's de facto monarchy succeed and the constitutional democracy of the USA fail and get weakened. And I've got no doubt at all that there's been an element of that in the British elite. So there was a narrow faction of the British elites that kind of welcomed the arrival of Trump on the scene, which was absolutely a ridiculous thing to do.
Including Prince Charles. And there's these incredible photos of him chumming up with Donald Trump and with Melania in a way that you didn't see from any of the other members of the royal family. And it seems to me that they were quite close, at least if not closest friends, they were close ideologically in a lot of things. And that is one of the biggest concerns as we see Charles approaching the regency as he becomes the future king. And that's going to happen years, maybe months. That will dramatically change the way the world operates because Charles is going to be the king. They still have a lot of power. Monarchs still have a ton of power. They control institutions, orders, and massive amounts of people.
Yeah, the monarch still has all kinds of power of veto over even the UK government if they're introducing laws that the monarch considers might actually impinge upon her rights or the rights of her family. She's got a right not to approve them.
Right.
And the monarchy and the heir to the throne, Charles, have got certain rights to be always consulted about certain things. And of course, they have this general power to lobby. Can you imagine more powerful lobbyists anywhere in the world able to influence politics and political decisions than actually a monarch and the monarch's heir?
And they're not meant to, but they do. At the end of the day, we had the spider memos, which were Charles's memos to a lot of secretaries, explaining to people exactly why they should be doing the job the way he thought they should be doing it. And still to this day, I think they have, as you mentioned, the Privy Council. There's so many other ways that they have to influence policy that it's just they're very powerful still. Obviously, they're the kings and queens of the greatest empire in the world. So it's really, you got to look at all this in that sense. Now let's take a look at some of these letters, because these are really striking, and I may not have the same ones that you have in front of you. So this is the one that's dated the 5th of August, 2015. It's dear Sir Christopher is the Queen's private secretary, right?
Yeah. Okay. He was. He's recently left that role and has now become, believe it or not, the ethics advisor appointed by Boris Johnson to the ministers.
We're going to discuss that in a little bit. But so let me read this to you. So thank you for your letter, 22nd June 2015, which letter states that I am asking Her Majesty to intervene in the island's domestic affairs, which I am not doing in the manner you suggest. Your letter further suggests that I should refer William Balhash.
Technically, the UK government has always, although the Crown dependencies have got a certain degree of independence, as we've already discussed, ultimately, constitutionally, it's always been clear that ultimately the UK government does have ultimate responsibility for good governance, the proper rule of law, and human rights on the Crown dependencies. Now, that used to be held by the Home Office, but for some mysterious reason, again, without any consultation with the people of the Crown dependencies, some years ago, that responsibility just got suddenly moved over to the UK Justice Department.
It's been like a hot potato. It's been moved around from one office to the other. And probably nothing happens while it gets transferred from side to side.
I think it was a very clear decision, because the people that hold all the Crown posts on Jersey are always lawyers and the local judiciary. And they've always had very close connections with London lawyers, like 7 Bedford Row, for example. And they've had all kinds of direct and long-established contacts with the English judiciary. So I no doubt about it at all that it was rather problematic, and getting it more so for the local authorities to be technically answerable to the Home Office, which has a law enforcement role. So they greatly preferred to suddenly go over to the Justice Department, so that change was made. Now, who was involved in that? That's a mystery in and of itself. But the mere fact, it's indicative of just how rotten and corrupt and problematic the Crown dependency situation is. When you're talking about the administration of justice, you're dealing with, in theory at least, of any parts of the state that should be impartial, objective, neutral, not involved in partisan, controversial political issues, then that's the Justice Department, right? The Ministry of Justice should be absolutely the last department of government that's got anything to do with really controversial, dubious, illegal and sleazy things like protecting mobs on the Crown dependencies. So you have to scratch your head and ask, what on earth is a Justice Department doing, having responsibility for the fundamentally problematic mob turfs of the tax havens like the Crown dependencies?
Good question. Really unbelievable. Let's continue reading here. Firstly, to draw to your attention that there is a direct and indirect body count as a result of the matters which I'm writing to you, and more particularly as a result of what I and others see as a breakdown in the rule of law consequent upon the island's abandonment by its monarch. There is an additional unquantifiable toll in human misery that stems from the matters which I am raising, and the fact that nobody has done anything effective since Dr. Philip Balash resigned, in quotation marks, soon after his infamous Liberation Day speech. Now, these are massive accusations that have been, as late as 2015, we're not talking about a long time ago, leveled against the Queen and the monarch through her private secretary then, Sir Christopher Gate. And these are stunning. Firstly, he talks about the body counts. So he's suggesting that what you were suggesting at the time, the murders. And then on top of that, the breakdown of rule of law. And that, I think, is referring specifically to the people who are governing there, the Balashes in particular.
That's right. But the Balash brothers are traditional Jersey crime family stock, a couple of local mobster lawyers, and Philip Balash got to become a Crown officer, that is directly appointed by the monarch via what is called her letters patent, which is her conferring, a letter authorizing power on her behalf. So all of the Jersey Crown officers, which includes people like the Solicitor General, the Attorney General, the Deputy Bailiff and the Bailiff, and a couple of others like the Lieutenant Governor and the Dean, they're appointed solely and expressly by the monarch. They are not answerable in any meaningful way to any entity, any kind of democratic or lawful accountability process on Jersey. Rather, they are solely appointed and empowered by the monarch. Now, these people...
that's going to be Charles in the future. So as we continue to discuss what Charles's involvement in all of this, it's Charles who will be picking these people who will be running Jersey in the future and overseeing this mob island. Some people might say
that's right.
Let me just finish up here, and then we'll get some more thoughts from you on what the rest of this is about. So your suggestion is that I refer William Balash's conduct to the island's authorities is not a viable one. There are no relevant authorities, as you've been telling us. The only authority we have is relevant to William Balash is our Duke. And which Duke is that? That would have been...
That's the monarch. That's the monarch, because the ancient tradition of the Channel Islands is that the English monarch is effectively one of our people, since William the Conqueror defeated the indigenous English monarch. William the Conqueror was the Duke of Normandy, the leader of Normandy, of which the islands, were a part. So ever since then, the islanders have customarily referred to the British monarch as our Duke, Notre Duc. Okay. So that's where that expression comes from.
And that's the only relevant authorities you've been telling us. So that's an interesting letter.